Okay, great. So, hi, y'all. Thank you so much for being here and for participating with us today. I'm so excited to be here with you and to be talking about queer activism in writing and rhetoric studies. Um, I already introduced myself. Erin already introduced herself, but I do just want to say part of where this conversation comes from is I met Erin at C's, and over dinner, we ended up sort of chatting about her research. And I think that it is so important and so exciting. And we'll talk a little bit about this, but I've done some research with queer activists in the past, and Erin's research just really, I don't know, it lit my fire, and I hope it lights your fire. And we're going to just spend some time talking about queer activism today. Erin, did you want to add anything to that?
Not really. Just I've enjoyed working with you on this presentation.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So today, while we're talking with y'all, we've got sort of 4 things that we're going to be working through or talking about. We'll give you a little bit of background on who we are, what kind of work we've been doing in the past or what we're doing now, and what our projects specifically focused on queer activism look like. We'll provide some definition and background that you might need just to kind of follow along with us, and then we'll have a conversation just between the two of us about what activists can teach us as scholars, as teachers, as citizens, as activists ourselves, and then we'll discuss a little bit about some resources.
So just a little bit about me. I primarily study Black queer literacies and CRT, composition theory, and a large portion of my research is around abolition, prison and police abolition. Like I said, I'm a PhD candidate in language writing and rhetoric at the University of Maryland. I also teach there. I'm currently in a graduate WPA role as well. And this summer, I'm currently doing research for my dissertation on abolitionist teaching of writing and literacy, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Sorry. So specifically about my research, like I said, Black queer literacies, but kind of thinking about all the different ways that Black queer people are composing, writing, and communicating, whether it's in activism, organizing, music, culture, social media, politics, and also education. And one of the kind of main theoretical frameworks that I use in my research is critical race theory, just because I find it really helpful for understanding laws and policies in education, and how kind of like systemic oppression, specifically like white supremacy, is kind of like engaging in those different areas, especially since I'm studying abolition, which is about like laws, policies, law enforcement, policing. So CRT is very helpful for that. And some methodology that has been guiding my research from CRT has been counter story, and then to kind of like complement that kind of storytelling, also autoethnography for kind of describing my own lived experiences with the things that I'm researching as a way to talk about the larger community of Black queer folks and the different ways that systemic racism or misogyny, capitalism is affecting us. And for my research in abolition, it kind of goes in different spaces, whether it's kind of social movements or in classrooms or just like my own kind of like personal relationships and friendships. I'm looking at how Black queer people are organizing and doing political education in our communities, how we're looking towards different approaches such as transformative justice as a way to heal and resolve violence instead of more punitive or retributive justice approaches. And then things that I'm using in my abolitionist teaching, such as like linguistic justice, ungrading, advocating for cop-free schools, and unionizing academia, and then also just centering joy in my classrooms. And a little bit about my dissertation. Right now, because it could change since I kind of just started and dissertations are just weird. I'm looking at the kind of arguments and counter arguments around abolition. So if you've heard about it, probably like in the summer 2020, people were talking about defund the police versus reform versus abolish. So thinking about how are abolitionists communicating and how are we talking to people about that and what are people like saying about it. I'm also looking at different kinds of carceral violence in education. So thinking about the school to prison pipeline, but also thinking about different approaches, practices, pedagogies in writing and literacy education that kind of mirror carceral violence outside of the classroom. And then I'm also looking at different abolitionist praxis that can be useful for comp pedagogy and writing program administration.
Erin, before we move on to my slide, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So in terms of counterstory and autoethnography as helping you, as serving as like your methodology for describing this sort of work, how do you see counterstory and autoethnography being used in your dissertation work as you move forward?
Yeah, so I, for counterstory specifically, I have a chapter that I'm doing that is a podcast chapter. I got this idea because I listened to a bunch of true crime podcasts, and one thing that I noticed was that a lot of true crime podcasts really do not center the victims or survivors. And so, and also a lot of them kind of paint police and prisons and the criminal justice system as kind of like the heroes. And so rarely ever have like true crime podcasts that are about police being the people who are committing harm and violence. And so I'm using counterstory as a way to counter the kind of like dominant mainstream narratives about policing and about incarceration to focus on a Black trans person who was killed by the police and telling their story from a more victim-centered approach. And then with autoethnography, I'm talking about how like to give kind of like descriptions of like abolitionist teaching. I'm using my own kind of like experience, my classroom practices, and reflecting on like what I'm doing to ensure that like I'm not having a classroom founded on like carceral logics. And so I'm finding it helpful to talk about my experience since I've had an experience where I've had like classrooms that I've been in as a student that were carceral, and how I'm not trying to replicate that kind of harm. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so from my end of this presentation, my research tends to focus on queer rhetorics or draws from queer rhetorics, cultural rhetorics, and then writing center studies because I am a writing center director. Right now, a lot of my research is focused on what activists can teach our discipline. There's a lot to unpack there, but specifically an activist group that I worked with and interviewed a few members of from my dissertation, the Lesbian Avengers, who were pretty prominent in the early 1990s. And I also have been pretty active in on the Social Justice Task Force for IWCA, the International Writing Centers Association. Since 2020, we put out an open letter to IWCA asking them to put out a statement at least and develop resources for students during COVID and also regarding racial justice and linguistic justice specifically. And IWCA, instead of necessarily putting out a statement right away, they created this task force, and I've been on that since then. So a lot of my research is focused on social justice in writing centers. And then I'm currently in the process of working on an edited collection for the WAC Clearinghouse on queer writing center praxis, which is maybe my favorite project right now. And I have finished data collection and I'm beginning writing with two other good friends about trauma-informed pedagogical practices in the first-year writing classroom. And those are all sort of disparate, but in many ways, they all feel very connected to the work that I've done in queer and cultural rhetorics and writing center studies. I've been an assistant professor and writing center director at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke since August of 2020. And then the research that I did with the Lesbian Avengers that I'll talk about a little bit today was conducted between 2018 and 2020 for my dissertation, which I'm now working on turning, as you know, this is the work of the academic, turning all of those chapters into usable academic articles. This is where I'm at. You want to move to the next slide? There we go. So in terms of drawing from queer and cultural rhetorics, I see them both as theoretical frameworks and as methods and methodologies. I use queer and cultural rhetorics as in order to better understand academic communities, like writing centers or the first year comp classroom, or even our Rhet Comp discipline itself, as a kind of community that through layered interactions and storying, we're constantly building our communities as we are just living our lives, interacting with each other. And cultural rhetorics has really helped me to understand and give language for seeing that. And I think queer theory for me is always useful when I'm thinking about understanding queer and then just non-normative forms of composing and making. And as valuable, I think there are still folks out there in our field who are making arguments for multimodal composition as like a legitimate form of meaning making. And I think queer theory helps us think about how non-normative forms of meaning making is critical, important, and a key part of our community building in and outside of the academy. So right now, the research questions that my publications are sort of seeking to answer are: what can queer activists like the Lesbian Avengers teach the rhetoric and composition discipline about how to build and sustain community? When I worked with the Lesbian Avengers, I thought I was going to be doing research about making objects and how the work of making objects helps you build community. And I did learn quite a bit about that, but they also taught me a lot about what it means to build and sustain community and how that can be applied to discipline building. And we're always building and rebuilding our discipline. And activists have a lot to teach us about that work. Both how it can be built and sustained, but also how it can be broken down and lost over time. Another question that I tend to be asking throughout my work are: how do queer students, scholars, teachers, and administrators engage queer praxis in their daily work? As administrators, like we've got seminal articles. I use the word seminal, I don't like to, but we've got articles out there that are, key parts of writing center research, like Queering the Writing Center by Harry Denny, that are incredibly theoretical. And I'm really interested in how people are doing queerness in their daily work as administrators and as tutors. What does it look like to be queer and to do queer in a writing center space or classroom? And then finally, what specific trauma-informed pedagogy practices can be engaged in the first year classroom? Because similarly, we have lots of theory and lots of discussion about the importance of trauma-informed pedagogy, but not a lot of suggestions for what practices those are and how to do them, how to implement them in your classroom. So that's part of my work there.
Okay, so next we're going to give some background and definitions about our research. So in terms of working with abolitionists and queer activism, I am going to leave you with one word and like a phrase, two definitions essentially, that I think are like a good starting point or a good way to kind of center queer activism and abolition. The first is prison industrial complex, or PIC, and this definition comes from Critical Resistance, which is a abolitionist organization founded by Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, two prominent abolitionist scholar activists. And so the PIC is pretty much this interest between like governments and industries that are trying to solve social, economic, political problems in society, but they're doing it with kind of carceral approaches such as imprisonment and like policing, surveillance, and any other ways that kind of like would be used, such as like courts, militaries, to kind of solve like those issues. And abolition is pretty much this theory, practice, political vision that is striving to dismantle the PIC, eliminate policing and imprisonment and surveillance and other kinds of carceral approaches to justice. And instead, we're focusing on things that are geared towards like the public good, such as community-based accountability, mutual aid, healthcare, housing, and education. And to give a graphic that might be helpful in understanding this, this is also from Critical Resistance. So if you start in the very center with those like set of interests that I mentioned, so for example, politicians or governments, these are the interests. And these interests are going to be empowered by different forces such as racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. And those forces, those interests that are empowered by those forces are going to be using a specific set of tools such as prisons, police, military, social control, like I said. And they're using those tools to respond to specific problems in our society, such as poverty, drug addiction, violence, political dissent. And by solving those issues with those problems, you can kind of see like where the issue is when you're like solving poverty by a tool that is empowered by racism or capitalism is going to not be a good solution. And by doing that, they're affecting specific demographics and groups of people, communities such as young people, queer people, disabled people, people of color, women, femme people, political dissenters. And then it doesn't really produce the results that you might think that you would, which those results usually are broken families, communities, more violence, more racism, more human rights violations, environmental injustice, hatred, fear, those kinds of things. So to go back to what I was talking about with abolition, those using those approaches for the public good, such as community-based accountability, if we think about the state, which is like the government, politicians, prisons, those are going to be things that are not going to actually help solve those issues. And they're obviously targeting communities such as queer communities. So leaning towards their own communities to kind of solve their issues and problems instead of the state, which is going to just enact more violence upon them. Mutual aid is something that I think is really important in queer activism. Something that might be kind of like relatable or something tangible to kind of understand is that a lot of queer people have chosen families. So a lot of queer people, we have been like disowned by our families and we've had to kind of make our own communities. And mutual aid is this organization theory where you have a group of people, a community, we're all trying to pitch in to help one another. And so that is a kind of really prevalent practice in queer activism and queer communities. And then obviously healthcare for all. There's a bunch of like legislation right now about like trans healthcare, and then access to education. I mean, we're seeing like state violence with that right now. You probably know about affirmative action, and then housing is just like another thing that can affect queer people.
Can y'all hear me and see me? I keep getting kicked out and all sorts of bad things are happening on my end. You can hear
Yes.
me? Okay, great.
Yes.
So I missed a little bit of that, Erin, because I got kicked out. But on my end, where my research and where some of the key terms that I'm coming from come from my research with the Lesbian Avengers, and specifically, I sort of came to an understanding of a concept that I sort of talk about as making as world making. This idea that when communities like queer communities, just as Erin was saying, often you have to sort of build your own world after the one that you were born into has in whatever way rejected you. When you come together to make things with other people, you engage in relationship and community building. And as you are doing that work of making things and building relationships and building your community, you're also, as a community, changing your own reality and the world around you as you do so. And I think when I first started doing this research, I thought, well, you make things together and then you make your world, but it's a really recursive process. The work of world building is imbricated constantly with the work of making things, and actually making your own community is an act of making, and interacting with people can be an act of making as well. So it's very subtle. It's an everyday work of layered and a lot of times invisible rhetorical acts of making. And it can teach us a lot about the rhetorical and cultural work of discipline building, which is where a lot of my research comes from. A little bit of background about the Lesbian Avengers who I worked with. I interviewed 4 members of the Lesbian Avengers who had been, 2 of them were founding members and 2 of them joined pretty early on. And they had been an activist organization most prominent from 1992 to 1995. And they were a direct action organization, which meant that, like ACT UP, they focused on doing things, protests, demonstrations, making things, going out into the community and being seen, doing and making, as opposed to something like a consciousness raising group or like a space where you're working through ideological, theoretical issues. And Sarah Schulman, in an interview with me, she said the worst thing that can happen in an organization is an organization of consensus. She says consensus is a nightmare. And mostly I think where she's coming from was that in this direct action group, to try to find consensus among every single member of an organization that had grown to 20,000 in a very short amount of time is very hard to do. So instead of trying to get everybody on board with the same idea or ideological perspective, they would have what she called a simultaneity of action, where people were doing things that they wanted to do, but they might not do certain things that they didn't feel comfortable with. And that way, the organization was able to continue moving and to continue working while not stalling or getting hemmed up in theoretical or ideological discussions that can keep them from getting the work of the direct action going. And that choice to build a concept of simultaneity of action and to engage in their group and their organization that way, I would argue was a kind of making of itself. That's how they made their organization. And that's also when they started turning more theoretical was actually when their organization started falling apart, because they started having those ideological conversations that broke them up. And I think we'll probably end up talking about that a little bit in our next part of our presentation.
Okay, so now we're going to kind of have a conversation about what activists can teach us. And the first question we're going to kind of talk about is, how has activism impacted how we see and make meaning in the world? For me specifically, I'm thinking about queer activism and abolition. There are 2 things that I would say have impacted me. And one is just thinking about harm reduction. I feel like it kind of has given me the critical thinking to just think about like how I have like been harmed in the world and how other communities have been harmed, and then also how I can think about that, reflect on it, and not reciprocate that onto other people, and to kind of think about how a lot of times harm is not just interpersonal, but it's also systemic, and the just having the analytical tools to unpack that and work towards dismantling that. And then secondly, I would also say um, not just like empathy. I feel like obviously like in the humanities, something that we tell a lot of people is that by studying the humanities, you can kind of like understand different people, different cultures, different just like knowledges and ways of thinking. And for me, activism has kind of like led me to not only understand different people and what they're going through, but also to kind of uh, I guess go back to what Elise was saying about direct action, is to follow that up with something, whether that's like advocating on like behalf of someone else, uh, you know, different kinds of allyship or accomplices or co-conspirators, depending on how you want to talk about that in activism. And I think those are kind of the two things for me, thinking about how it has impacted me and how I kind of like navigate within the world.
Yeah, I agree. I think I feel very similarly. Uh, I guess the one of the takeaways that I definitely learned from working with the Lesbian Avengers was this idea of making sure that you have some kind of actual actionable takeaway in every situation that you're in. Sarah Schulman told me that at the end of every Lesbian Avenger meeting, they would go and point to every single person in the room and say, okay, what are you going to do for before next meeting? And what are you? She said that it used to really piss people off. You have to hold people accountable to it, but it has honestly, it has changed the way that I do meetings, or even just like in my day-to-day life. If I'm but especially in a meeting, if I'm in a meeting, and we all know how this happens in academia, they often are just completely, could have been emails, and there's no action items in the end. And I really try to have some moment at the very end of a meeting where I'm like, okay, well, what needs to get done before the next time that we meet? Let's make sure that we have deadlines and actions that we can engage in. And what you said about harm reduction, again, really makes me think about the Lesbian Avengers. And when they fell apart, it was one of the Lesbian Avengers, one of the only Black women in the Lesbian Avengers, said that she felt like when they started falling apart, it was because they had not really built a good foundation of trust with one another. So when they started having really difficult conversations, specifically about race, they didn't have a foundation of trust in order to move forward together. And to start actually building something on, really difficult discussion points and real ideological issues that were happening in the organization. And I think some of it was when you are marginalized in any capacity, it's very difficult to not carry that hurt with you, and to also separate yourself from the hurt that's been caused to you. I think it's work of its own. I don't know if that makes sense. But it can be very, I think one thing that Sarah Schulman often said was that when you have folks who have been marginalized and told their whole lives that they can't do anything, when you're asking them to act in activism, that even just that move from you have a responsibility to act and do and to not create harm can be really difficult to, like, emotionally difficult to process and then engage in. And I see that all the time in every part of life, not just in academia or in activism, but, everywhere. If you've been hurt, it's very hard to find ways to move forward in your life without hurting others as well.
Should we get to the next question?
Yeah, let's do it.
So how has activism impacted your WPA work and teaching? I would say for me, um, in terms of teaching, I have had to just think about the generic kind of like policies and assessment practices that I was like kind of like told to use when teaching. And so like I one thing that I am grappling with, or I think probably everyone right now who is an educator is grappling with, is like attendance and getting students to like show up, and thinking about like how like penalizing or punishing like how students show up is something that I kind of reflect on a lot. And then I mean, in our field we have been having for a very long time conversations about assessing like how students are writing. And then just in like writing program administration work, I would say I kind of am following that same mindset in the work that I'm doing of like how can like, and in terms of like writing and proposing programmatic policies that are like not geared towards like penalizing and punishing students, but instead creating spaces where they can like thrive and have some kind of joy in education.
Mhm. Yeah, it's hard to do. I agree. Especially when I'm thinking about what you said earlier about ungrading. In the last year, I've done a lot more labor-based grading, and it's working in my class. And I also have an incredibly generous extension policy, which is if you ask for an extension, I will give it to you, and that's it, no questions asked. And I also my attendance policy, I take attendance, but it has no reflection on students' grades, which means that I'm directly going against the attendance policy that's in place by my department. And just no one's caught me yet. And that's, I think, one of the things that we struggle with is that if we want to have a non-carceral way of grading or running an English program or a writing program or our own classroom, we're working within an institution that is carceral in nature, and is, the grading system wasn't designed to be punitive the way that it feels now, I think, but our attendance policies, our grading policies, they sort of put us into a position where if we want to engage in something that looks like trauma-informed or just non-carceral education, you end up often violating the policies of the place that you are hired to work in. And that's really precarious and difficult, especially if you're a new scholar or like not yet tenured in my particular case.
I think it's really difficult. I mean, the like work is like, in a best case scenario, it could be something like more like systemic change for like an entire like university to like change like, or all of like just like education in general. But I can't just like snap my fingers and like for that to happen. And to do that on the individual level, it's just like a lot. I mean, activist work is very dangerous. So even doing this kind of stuff, if you're like going against like university policies to do something to have a classroom that is actually might be better for your students, but your university says no. So that puts you in a very difficult place. So yeah, I hear that all the time, that it's really difficult. It's difficult for me to do too. So
yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's definitely, and I will say that it's helpful when you find your people, just even not necessarily in your institution, though it is helpful. Like I found the few of my teacher friends at my university who are on board, and kind of when I tell them like, oh, I'm doing labor-based grading, they are really interested and they want to join in. And the more people you have sort of trying this out, the less, if you've got some naysayer in the department who's been around forever, who's like, hey, why are you doing this? You can be like, well, Hannah does it too, and like, just, there is strength I mean, really, activism, I think, can show you how much there is strength in numbers. And That's also it's incredibly important to have conversations like this, or in our own professional organizations like CES or IWCA or the WPA. Like, when we are having these conversations, we can refer back to them when we're trying to explain to our chairs or our deans why this work is important and where the research is behind it. I want to be mindful of time, so we probably should move on to the next one. Yeah, Savannah?
Okay, how are people being persecuted by right-wing policymakers?
Oh my God, just today.
I know, yeah.
A horrible day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like the conversation, as I was like reflecting on this, I was thinking like that, I mean, prior like years ago that we were like having conversations about like bathroom bills, and now like the legislation has transcended to just like eradication of just like trans existence, just like entirely. And so I think that's definitely like how we're being persecuted, and just like in different ways, because a lot of trans people also have interlocking identities and communities. So it's for some queer people, it's not just the anti-LGBTQ legislation. Sometimes it's also the anti-Blackness, or like misogyny or ableism and other things as well that are happening with like the different policies that are coming out.
Right. Yeah. I think it's very easy for someone who is not necessarily on a daily basis bodily impacted by these policies to think about, these are really terrible and I'm really mad about them. But and also I think for all of us, it is sometimes easier to try to disassociate from everything that's happening in the world right now. I know I do it just in order to make it through the day and get my kids fed and go, be able to sleep at night. But this last weekend was Pride here in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I wanted to bring my kids, but I had to contact the head of the Pride Festival and make sure that, like, one, what is security looking like, which already is like, I don't know about how do I feel about security as a whole, and how they sought it out and who are the people going to be patrolling the area in the first place. But also, I wasn't even sure, because policy is changing all the time. I wasn't even sure if my kids were going to be allowed there, or if that was going to get turned away if I brought my children. And so it is, and from my own university, we have hosted many drag shows at our university in the past, but last year, the university, we received enough threats of violence that instead of increasing security or finding a way to make the drag show happen, we just canceled it. And while that, is, I think some might see it as just a small inconvenience, it really does feel, and it really truly is, an attack on our entire existence. And I have students who, they're only out at the university that we're at. And if the university can't be the space of safety, then there is no space of safety. And if there are only a few faculty or staff or friends that can be of support, it just is a really, really bleak. It's a really bleak existence right now. And it's very hard to just live now. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So how are activists responding, and how are activists sustaining each other? I would say that activists are honestly responding the best way that they can. Something that I think is important in terms of like sustaining is realizing that like Elise said, like strength in numbers it's really like a kind of key fundamental just like concept in activism, that like the masses have power. And I think that burnout is also something that is very easy for activists to endure. And so if you have only just like a select few of people who are trying to do all of this work, then it's going to be really hard to sustain it. And the more people you have in leadership, the more people you have who are contributing to this work, it is a lot easier. And then burnout obviously is that like when you have people who, it's already very difficult, just like if you're a queer person having to go to a workplace that might, you're suffering like microaggressions all the time, to also be advocating on your behalf to like governments and politicians and other like authority figures that you might like, it might be in your workplace yourself. So that kind of work is just, it's exhausting to do. So that's why also like mutual aid is very important for activism. When you have people, you just need more people, and the masses are gonna kind of like help sustain that movement.
Yeah, I think, again, learning from the Lesbian Avengers, that you just, even the concept of simultaneity of action means that when one set or subset of people are out doing one action or one mutual aid service, there are a set that are resting, because you can't, I think something that, especially when I was a grad student, I got very, very burnt out feeling like I had to do all the things all the time and speak out against all the things every day, all the time. It felt like my own social responsibility. And it's just it's unsustainable. But it can be made sustainable if you are thinking about rest as like as a radical practice of making sure that you can continue on to do the activism. And when you have strength in numbers and simultaneity of action, it means that while you're resting, somebody else is out on the front lines trying to get something done. And yeah, so I think those are key things to remember, is that rest is a radical part of activist practice.
Okay, and this is our last question. What can scholar activists do to make change amidst an increasingly racist anti-LGBTQ climate? I think the one thing that scholar activists can do is to change, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the sustaining, is to change the mindset that we're currently in. This is something that, as I've been working with other grad students to unionize our university, is that it's kind of hard to get people who to even like want to like organize to make their workplace better, that they're like going every single day and getting paid to do. And so it's kind of harder to even get people to look outside of their workplace and to just like larger society to be like, I need you to also be committed to doing things to make changes in our society. That's also a very big ask, just because for some people it is, I only have time to have like a 5-5 teaching load. I have a family, I have other responsibilities. I can only do so much. And so, and that usually is kind of like the excuse for like why sometimes we can't like be committed to do stuff. But yeah, I think the mindset of just like at least being committed to like trying to and be engaged and do work to make change happen is one of the things that can like at least get like the ball rolling to start something.
Yeah. I think people think of activism as this big thing. Like if I'm not at a protest, or if I'm not doing a big thing, or if I'm not making actual political action happen, then do I really count as doing activism? And I think COVID changed everything for me as an instructor, in the sense that my new motto every day, especially as a writing center director, is it's like yes, I am concerned about making sure that students at my university are receiving quality tutor. But my main job right now as an educator and as a writing center director is to try to answer and think about the question of, are my tutors and my students well? And how can I help them to be more well today? And that doesn't mean like, am I calling their mothers, or am I finding them? Sometimes it does mean like, am I finding them a bagel and some cream cheese today because I haven't eaten anything? Or am I asking them if they've had any water today, because Gen Zers just do not be drinking the water. I don't know. But it's also about like, what can I do in my classroom, like you were saying, to facilitate joy or to just check in. And so I think as an instructor and as a scholar activist, I think the thing to do is to live out your values every day, and whatever that looks like. How do you find a way to make sure that your students and your colleagues or whoever you're working with, how do you help people to be a little bit more well today? And that has really changed the way that I work with my students, and I see the work. I see it every day. I see results every day by just sort of changing my mindset in that way. And I think the space where I'm doing the most and creating the largest impact is with the students that I'm interacting with on a daily basis. Yeah, so very similar to what you said, Erin. So we have this slide of lots of scholarship. We really could have made maybe 12 more slides like this, but these are a few of the key pieces that have been influential to us. And I don't know how I have not known about the Abolitionist Teaching Network, Erin, but it is an incredibly useful resource. And thank you for putting it on here. It's been super helpful for me in planning my own syllabus for the next semester.
Yay. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for listening to us.